It was an unusually quiet evening, the kind of silence where even the faintest sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock felt like a drumbeat, and the soft rustle of leaves against the window broke the stillness. I had just curled up on my well-worn couch, book in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other, when a sudden knock on the door startled me. It was too late for casual visits, and I hesitated, my heartbeat quickening. Who could it possibly be at this hour? Setting my book aside, I adjusted my robe and padded softly to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw my neighbour, Daniel. His tall frame seemed to fill the narrow view, and even in the dim light of the porch, I could see the tension etched on his face. His shoulders were hunched, and his gaze darted nervously. "Daniel?" I asked cautiously, opening the door just a crack. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated, his lips parting as if searching for the right words. "I am sorry to bother you so late," he began, his voice a mix of apology and something deeper urgency. He raked a hand through his dishevelled hair, a gesture that betrayed the turmoil beneath his composed exterior. I didn't know who else to turn to. Caught off guard, I blinked. Daniel and I were friendly enough neighbours who exchanged occasional small talk or helped each other out with little favours. But this felt different. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The air outside was biting, and I didn't have the heart to leave him standing there. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping into the warmth of my living room. I closed the door behind him, a strange sense of anticipation stirring in my chest. Whatever had brought him here wasn't trivial. Daniel settled on the edge of my couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. His usual calm demeanour seemed replaced by something of vulnerability. I sat across from him, the steam from my tea coiling lazily between us like a fragile thread. "Do you want something to drink?" I offered, unsure of how to break the silence. He shook his head. "No, thank you," he said softly, his voice wavering. I just need to talk to someone. I hope that's okay." "Of course," I said, leaning in slightly. His words carried a weight that made me pause, sensing the storm brewing behind his careful composure. "You've always been kind to me," he continued, his gaze lifting to meet mine. "More than most people. That's why I felt like I could come here tonight." I smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. His vulnerability caught me off guard, but it also stirred something within me, a desire to be there for him in a way I hadn't expected. "Whatever it is, Daniel, I am here," I said gently, my words steady, despite the swirl of emotions brewing inside. For a moment, he seemed to gather himself, his eyes searching mine as if seeking reassurance. Then he spoke. His voice was steady, but tinged with pain, as he described the loneliness that had crept into his life, the mounting pressures of living up to everyone's expectations, and the slow erosion of joy over the years. I listened intently, my heart aching for him. Daniel wasn't just my neighbour. He was a man quietly fighting battles I hadn't known existed. As he spoke, I realised how easy it was to overlook the struggles of others, especially when they hid them so well behind polite smiles and friendly small talk. "I didn't mean to dump all of this on you," he said after a while, his voice softer now. I didn't know who else would understand." "I am glad you came," I replied, and I meant it. The hours slipped by in a blur of conversation. What began as a one-sided confession grew into something deeper. We talked about everything life, fears, regrets, and fleeting moments of happiness. Laughter bubbled up unexpectedly in between heavier topics, And with each shared word, a connection began to form. Fragile, yet undeniable. At some point, I noticed the clock. Midnight had come and gone, and the dim lighting in the room cast a warm, almost ethereal glow. "I should go," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stood slowly, but his movements were hesitant, as if torn between staying and leaving. "You don't have to do this alone," I said softly, standing as well. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. There was something unspoken in his Gazian, unasked question, a silent plea. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The contact sent an unexpected warmth coursing through me, leaving me momentarily breathless. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for listening." Then he left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me standing there in the quiet stillness of my living room. I stood at the door for a long time after Daniel left, my thoughts swirling. Something had shifted that night, not just between Daniel and me, but within myself. For so long, I had been consumed by my routines, my carefully constructed solitude, that I hadn't realized how much I craved connection. The next few days passed in a blur. Daniel and I found excuses to see each other, each interaction layering on the warmth we'd begun to build. He'd stop by to return a borrowed tool or share a recipe he thought I'd like. I'd find reasons to linger near our shared fence or offer him leftover cookies from a baking spree. It felt natural, unforced, as if we'd both been waiting for someone to break through the walls we'd built. One evening, Daniel called. His voice on the phone was lighter, more assured. "I wanted to show you something," he said, an almost boyish excitement in his tone. When I stepped outside, the night air was crisp, and the stars scattered across the sky like a mosaic. Daniel stood in his backyard, holding a telescope. "I used to love stargazing," he admitted as I approached. "Haven't done it in years." We spent the next hour pointing out constellations and sharing stories about childhood dreams. There was a quiet intimacy in the simplicity of it, just two people finding joy in the vastness of the universe. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed small changes in myself. I began to look forward to our conversations, the way his laughter filled the air, or how his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It wasn't just about him, though. Through Daniel's vulnerability, I found myself opening up as well, sharing pieces of my life I'd long kept tucked away. But with the growing connection came an undeniable tension. One evening, as we stood on my porch after another of his impromptu visits, Daniel hesitated. "Here is something I need to tell you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. My heart quickened. "What is it?" He looked away for a moment, then back at me, his expression serious. "I've been trying to sort out my feelings about my life, my choices, everything. And you've been the one thing that's made sense through it all." I wasn't sure how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with implications we'd both been tiptoeing around. "Daniel," I began, but he interrupted. "I am not asking for anything," he said quickly. I needed you to know. You've reminded me that it's okay to feel, to hope, and I can't thank you enough for that." The vulnerability in his voice left me speechless. We stood there in silence, the cool night air wrapping around us like a shared secret.